Right, hello everybody. Another Iceberg. This one is the greatest achievements ever in boxing. Now again, the way the iceberg is layered it's the most known achievements at the top. So many people on the goats of boxing one were thinking the ones at the top are number 1, 2, 3, 4. That's not how these work. The idea of the iceberg is sort of the further down you go, the more obscure things are. So this one is a list of achievements. I'm going to zoom in because I'm aware you probably can't see it like this. Basically, the most mind-blowing achievements that have ever been accomplished in boxing history. The further we go down, the more you're going to see how unbelievable some fighters' accomplishments are. Some of them just defy belief. So starting off with Mayweather Jr., 50-0. This is probably the most popular achievement in the world today, to be honest, amongst most of the boxing fans and most of your more casual boxing fans in the world today. The achievement in itself is retiring with the most fights and 100% perfect win ratio, 50 fights. As I touched upon in the other video, Ricardo Lopez actually retired 52 fights unbeaten. He went 51-0, but he had one draw. Rocky Marciano went 49-0. You can make a bit of an argument that does Conor McGregor really count to the 50, making his debut. I guess if Floyd fought Conor McGregor sort of within his first 10, 15 fights, it would just be another one in his career. So ultimately, when you look at Mayweather's resume, it's completely stacked. So I think this is a pretty phenomenal achievement. 23 different world champions defeated across 5 different weight divisions. There's not many fighters that you can say through history have done that. There are a few. Obviously, the thing with the world champions argument is Floyd just boxed in an era with way more world champions and way more divisions. So I don't necessarily think that achievement in itself, which is the official record, is as impressive as it sounds. It's freakishly impressive. There's a reason that no other fighter in the modern era has that, because it's amazing. But, you know, when you go back to guys like Ezard Charles and Sugar Ray Robinson, Henry Armstrong and Roberto Duran even, like, if there were more belts around in those eras, those guys' numbers would be through the roof. Like a Harry Greb, for instance, as well. So, yeah, 50-0, brilliant achievement. He was pretty invincible throughout these years as well, like throughout his entire career. And the longevity is incredible. People think that Castillo beat him in the first fight. I've always watched it and given it to Floyd, although it is very close. I always thought the Maidana fight was close, but to be honest with you, I think he won both. Especially in the Castillo case, and ultimately he won the rematch quite convincingly. The flaw I would pick with this particular achievement is I think after a while, after he was fighting those killers at 130 and so on, I think this became the goal, to remain undefeated. It was so financially viable and it became so marketable to stay undefeated that I think for quite a long period of the Money Mayweather years, certain opponents were avoided at certain times, and it was a bit more carefully manipulated to make that 50-0 record. Nevertheless, it's one of the great achievements in boxing. Right, moving on to Manny Pacquiao's 8 weight divisions. Yeah, this one's just nuts, to be honest with you. No one's actually come close to this. Oscar De La Hoya was a 6th division champion. But yeah, I mean, even if Manny was a 7th division champion, he would have cleared it. But to go 8 is just, it's nuts. I mean, Manny was obviously a 7th division champion. But yeah, to go an extra division is crazy. But the craziest thing about this is that from his jump to from flyweight to junior middleweight, he skipped 2 divisions as well. So the whole thing is actually 10 different weight divisions. Considering the fact that it was over such a long period of time, Manny didn't duck fighters. He had those wars against Morales, Barrera, Marquez before he was even really a global superstar. He obviously became a superstar, but to fight Margarito when Margarito was a beast, Cotto as well, Ricky Hatton, De La Hoya. I mean, the one thing you could say is maybe catch weights, but yeah, I mean, like he was 10 weight divisions above where he won his first world title. So it's crazy. Again, I can't see this one being beaten in the modern era, because it becomes even more freakish when you put it into context. I don't know, use Naoya Inoue, for instance, because he's come from a similar weight division. If Inoue was to mimic this achievement, he's already a 4-division champion, Inoue. But he skipped one as well, so he's actually gone across 5 divisions. But I think Inoue started at junior flyweight. So if he wanted to become an 8 division champion, from now, he'd have to move up and clear out the featherweight division, and then move up and clear out the super featherweight division, and then beat the likes of Tank, Shakur Stevenson, move up to lightweight, and then go up to junior welterweight. The guys, Teofimo Lopez. It's just not going to happen. It's physically borderline impossible. Obviously not completely impossible because Manny showed that, but yeah, it's a crazy achievement. Moving on to the Rumble in the Jungle. Now, with hindsight, this is the victory that cements Ali as one of the greatest fighters ever. George Foreman was 40-0 with 38 knockouts to this point. He had absolutely ragdolled Joe Frazier and Ken Norton, and they were the 2 men who had beaten Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali was seen to have slowed down, and people going into this fight were seriously concerned, not just for Ali losing, but the fact that he might lose his life in the ring or get seriously damaged. Foreman was an absolute monster, so to go out and soak up the punches with the rope-a-dope tactic, which no one expected, it's a crazy achievement. And to go out and get the knockout, the only time Foreman was ever knocked out in his career, which spanned well into the 90s, it's definitely up there as one of the greatest victories ever, especially with the hype around the fight as well. And staying on the heavyweights, we got 2 with Tyson back-to-back. Tyson becoming the youngest heavyweight champion at 20 years old. Now, this has stood the test of time. It was 1986 he won that title, so it's nearly 40 years it stood. I don't think it's one of the rarer ones because Patterson was also the youngest heavyweight champion of the world before. I think he was 21. So I think it's one that could potentially be beaten, but it was just how good Tyson was in his 20s, or in his teens and early 20s. He was absolutely demolishing the heavyweight scene. Again, it wasn't necessarily the most stacked heavyweight scene. He beat Trevor Berbick for the title. As he sort of established himself as the undisputed champion, he was beating really good fighters like Michael Spinks. But yeah, this is a pretty phenomenal one, and I think it shows, and I think it'll be difficult to beat. Moses Atama's trying to beat it, but yeah, fighters, especially heavyweights, it's pretty freaky to be able to take on guys that big, especially nowadays at just 20 years of age and win at the world level. So it's a phenomenal achievement. Buster Douglas knocking out Tyson, 42-1 underdog. Now, with hindsight, you can say, Tyson, the writing was on the wall. Tyson wasn't focused in camp. He was even dropped in sparring, I believe, going into this fight. Cus D'Amato had died. He dropped Kevin Rooney. He had a team around him, Don King, that were just leeching off of him, and he wasn't focused. But that's with hindsight. Going into the fight, Tyson was still a killer. He was still the baddest man on the planet. And Buster Douglas had lost quite a lot of his heavyweight fights, especially against the big boys. I know he'd lost to Tony Tucker going into that fight. And like I say, there's a reason he was a 42-1 underdog. It's widely considered the greatest upset in boxing history, still all these years later. The drama of it, the fact that Douglas's mum died a few days before the fight, and he'd done it for her. The fact he climbed off the canvas, the controversy of the long count as well. I mean, I think lots of people think a 10 count is a stopwatch count to 10, but it isn't. It's just, within reason, the ref can take a little bit of time. He's given 10 seconds how he wants to count it to see how the fighter is. So I don't mind the long count in that instance getting up. But yeah, to come back and to see Tyson just trying to put his mouthpiece in, it's absolutely spine-tingling. It gives me goosebumps every time I watch it. It's the ultimate Rocky underdog story. Right, moving down to the second tier. The top tier is kind of one which, just people around today will have heard of. People will know Floyd Mayweather, and he was undefeated. People will know Pacquiao was an 8 division champion. And those ones below are so iconic with the Ali-Tyson links. But below, everyone should really know these. They're still iconic, but I think your more casual fan wouldn't necessarily know all of these achievements. Starting with George Foreman becoming the oldest heavyweight champion of the world at 46 against Michael Moorer. Now this one's nuts because Foreman had come back. He'd been back a while by this point. He'd had like dozens of fights, and really this one, it was a shock. A massive shock. You had Jim Lampley. It happened in the commentary because people were like, nah, that won't happen. But I think people were more surprised by the resistance he put up against Evander Holyfield and Tommy Morrison early on, especially Holyfield, because that was like the test. Once he'd done that, people were like, oh man, he can still hang with the big boys. But yeah, I mean, down on the cards, landing the right hand, it looked like it had nothing on it, and just flattened Michael Moore. Just still got that legendary punching power. And there's an interesting story that the shorts he's wearing are the same shorts he fought Muhammad Ali in the Rumble in the Jungle. So yeah, pretty cool. Moving on to Jones Jr., becoming the world champion from middleweight to heavyweight, whilst clearing up light heavyweight in between. Well, not clearing up, he didn't fight Mikushevsky, but he did become undisputed, so basically cleared up. And he looked untouchable for a decade, maybe like the greatest fighter you've ever seen in the modern era. Yeah, this is crazy, just because of how big heavyweight champions are these days. You would say that John Ruiz was one of the more beatable heavyweight champions. It's quite interesting, actually, because John Ruiz also lost to James Toney for the heavyweight title, and Toney mimicked this achievement from middleweight to heavyweight, but he failed a drugs test, so he never actually officially stood. So I would say that John Ruiz was one of the more beatable ones. But yeah, I mean, the way Roy did this over a decade is freaky. But it's mad, because it's probably not even the greatest middleweight to heavyweight run that's on this list. So we'll look at some of them later down the line. And moving on to Rocky Marciano being the only unbeaten retired heavyweight champion. Now, I think this is really quite impressive, because whilst you might think, you know, fighters do fight that, you know, Tyson Fury was recently unbeaten, Usyk is unbeaten. For as long as Marciano has held that record, I mean, he retired, I believe, in 1956. That record still stood, and it has to be a completely unbeaten champion. Like, there can't be a draw, 100% win ratio. And the thing I find most amazing about Marciano's career is just how short it was and how much he achieved. I don't think he started boxing until he was 23, and he was done by like his very early 30s, from start to finish. He reigned from 52 to 56, and he had a lot of those fights in a very short period of time. There were a few light touches along the way, but then when he started fighting Roland Nastaza and Rex Lane and those kind of guys, he was having real tough fights. Beat Joe Louis, and then beat some great, all-time greats in Archie Moore, Ezra Charles and Jersey Joe Walcott. So yeah, I think this is a pretty phenomenal achievement, especially with all the physical disadvantages he had. You know, he was underrated skillfully, but quite a cumbersome fighter compared to like the likes of Charles. He was very small as well, one of the smallest ever heavyweight champions. And he didn't have a style that you would link to perfection. He took shots, he brawled, he had to dog it out. And with all those physical disadvantages, just through sheer desire and an awkward style and relentless intensity, he achieved the perfect record. And I think it's quite befitting that that's never been matched. Obviously at heavyweight, I know Mayweather went 49-0 against world champions, and then obviously 50-0. But moving on to Joe Louis's heavyweight reign. Now, this is one everyone should know because it was just freaky. Joe Louis won 26 successive world title fights. All as champion, he beat tons of Hall of Famers in this reign, and it spanned 11 and a half years. So basically, for the entire decade, he was the sole heavyweight champion of the world. Just demolished people, literally had the touch of death. Like, as soon as he touched you with a right uppercut, a right hand, a left hook, anything, fighters were flying. I mean, you'll see the videos on here of Louis just battering people. It's the longest individual reign heavyweight history. Klitschko actually surpassed it with his multiple reigns. But yeah, this is crazy. Joe Louis was seen as a boxing god after this. Inoue, Usyk and Terence Crawford's 2-weight undisputed. Yeah, this is pretty impressive. I think we'll see more of this. I think fighters are just jumping up in weight now. There are certain times in which, you know, you may just be able to get all the belts in one shot. I know there's been a few. Jermaine Taylor done that in recent years. I think Devin Haney might have done that as well. Picked up all the belts in one go. But yeah, regardless, these guys here did it in a really tough way. I mean, Inoue, for instance, literally cleared out the bantamweights with ease, like systematically beat them all up. Obviously, there was the Nonito Donaire fight, which was an absolute war at that weight. But yeah, he stopped Rodriguez and Payano within like 2 rounds. And then the most impressive thing about that is within a year of doing that, he was undisputed in the next division. And they were tough fights against Stephen Fulton and Marlon Tapales. Usyk, I mean, that could be the most impressive one, to be honest, because that cruiserweight run was killer. And again, he went to everyone's home country to beat him. And then obviously went up to beat Tyson Fury. Daniel Dubois, not for a title, but he is a champion now. And Anthony Joshua twice. That's a pretty murderer's row in the modern context. And Terence Crawford had, the light welterweight run. He was the first star to do it. And then obviously moved up and basically knocked everyone out of welterweight with that standout masterclass against Errol Spence. So he has, maybe Usyk has it against Fury, but you'd say Terence definitely has the masterclass out of the three against the pound-for-pound star. Right, moving down. Now this one, people know Chavez is 89-0, but I don't think people quite know the level he fought in these 90 fights, because there was one draw as well, which I think he lost, if I'm honest with you, to Pernell Whitaker. But he had 27 world title fights in this run, and he beat the likes of Edwin Rosario, Jose Luis Ramirez, Roger Mayweather a couple of times, Hector Camacho, Meldrick Taylor, Rocky Lockridge, who was a great world champion, Danilo Cabrera. There were so many great fighters he beat in this run. To go 90 fights unbeaten, yeah, I mean, imagine if he retired after that 90th fight. You would be talking a ridiculously high claim for a GOAT conversation. He went through 3 weight divisions, and it's one of the best runs in boxing history. And moving on to Triple G. Triple G had around 40 fights as a pro. Obviously boxed Canelo in those 2 great fights, in the third one, which was a bit of a mismatch because he was past his best. Boxed big punches in David Lemieux, Danny Jacobs, and he was never seemingly rocked with right hands. He ate big shots as well, even against Murata later on. You could see him eating those big punches. But more impressively is he had 350 amateur fights as well, where he was fighting top names consistently. I know as an amateur he boxed Andy Lee, who had that dynamite right hook. He boxed one of the Durrell brothers. He knocked out Lucien Boutte. So yeah, having never been dropped or seemingly rocked, is seriously impressive across 400 fights. Lomachenko's amateur record is just like jaw-droppingly unbelievable. This is one of the best achievements on here. I was an amateur boxer. I boxed quite a few national champions. I boxed an Olympic medalist in Lewis Richardson, who just boxed in the Olympics. So I boxed at a decent level. I had 26 fights and I lost 8 times. And my record was pretty good. I won a few titles. To go 400 fights practically and lose once, you cannot even comprehend that level of activity alone, let alone basically never losing. He lost to Albert Selimov, who he avenged twice. He was a 2-time Olympic champion, 2-time world champion, European champion, world junior champion. I mean, it's the greatest amateur record I've ever seen. And equally as a pro, he would do incredible things. Like he was the fastest world champion, 2-weight world champion, and 3-weight world champion. But what people don't know about Lomachenko is that he boxed in the World Series of Boxing as an amateur. So like the last sort of 6 fights of his career, well, I think there were 5 3-minute rounders without headgear, with smaller gloves, without a vest. So he kind of had 5 pro fights before he made his debut, against top amateurs as well. Right, moving on to Roberto Duran defeats Barkley. This might be one people sort of frown at, but what you got to understand is the context here. Roberto Duran was an aggressive fighter, okay? So he would walk his opposition down. He was as crafty as you got defensively. He was one of the most complete fighters ever. But as a lightweight, no one could match him. As a welterweight, people struggled at his best. He ultimately started slowing down a little at welterweight, and Kirkland, Lang, Leonard and Benitez would outpoint him. But to move up to middleweight, which is 7 weight divisions above featherweight, which is where he beat his first world champion, Ernesto Marcel, and to outgun Iron Barkley, who sparked Tommy Hearns, and Tommy Hearns was the only man to ever knock out Duran cold. To do that in its own is freakish. That would make him a 7-division champion, really, if we're going off the champions he beat, from Ernesto Marcel at featherweight to middleweight. But he did it at 38 years of age, like completely seemingly past his best. He hadn't done anything amazing for years. And he went in against Barkley and had an absolute war. 2 took his greatest shots, took his best shots, done like a 360 spin off a left hook but firmed it, and even dropped Barkley. So I think winning this was genuinely a miracle victory. Bernard Hopkins becoming boxing's oldest ever world champion is, yeah, I mean, he was 49 years of age when he beat Bube Shimanov for the WBA titles, and he was already the IBF champion as well after he defeated Zavoris Cloud. Yeah, that's nuts. And even the fact that he went 12 rounds near his 50th birthday against Sergey Kovalev. Kovalev was an absolute killer at that time. Yeah, this is crazy to have that longevity, especially after being a middleweight champion for so long. But truthfully, Hopkins' career after his 40s alone is Hall of Fame worthy. I mean, he beat Winky Wright, he beat Antonio Tarver, Kelly Pavlik, passed his best Roy Jones, Jean Pascal, and then become the oldest champion ever. Yeah, seriously impressive stuff. Right, moving down, these are ones where your more hardcore fans will start to know about these. You probably have heard of them, but yeah, we'll cover them anyway. Edwin Valero, man, what an absolute savage this guy was. I mean, he ended up killing his family, which is absolutely terrible. I mean, he was a really violent guy. But as a fighter alone, I mean, the stories we hear about him are absolutely ferocious. I mean, he was only around in the mid-2000s to 2010, which is when he died. And they were touting a Pacquiao fight as well, which Pacquiao was on top of his game at this point. And Valero was the lightweight world champion, but in this 18 fight streak, he was also a super featherweight world champion, I must say. But during this 18 fight streak, it was his first 18 fights. The competition wasn't anything crazily special, but to go 18 times and score 18 consecutive first round knockouts is just ridiculous. So yeah, I especially as he's gone on to be a good world champion, I think this is a pretty cool achievement. And when you hear the sparring stories as well, like about how he used to beat everyone up and how powerful he was, how he broke Eric Morales' nose, very special fighter but very troubled man. El Radar, Wilfred Benitez, becoming boxing's youngest ever world champion at just 17. Yeah, this one's nuts. The most amazing thing about this is it isn't even the greatest title win for a 17-year-old, but we'll come to that in a sec. Because this is probably in the top 3, 4, 5 on this list, I'd say. Being a world champion at 17 in the 15-round era is... And Benitez would go on to win multiple titles and beat like Roberto Duran and Carlos Palomino. Even Antonio Cervantes, who he beat, was like one of the great champions of his time, one of the most underrated champions, made loads of title defences. Cervantes even beat Nicolino Loche, the chain-smoking Argentine defensive genius. Yeah, this is nuts. Unfortunately, Benitez would go on to suffer with ill health, and he would take some pretty brutal knockouts by the time he was in his mid-20s. So he had a really, really early prime. But going on to saying that this isn't even the greatest title win at 17, I mean, it's definitely up there, winning over 15 rounds. But Sam Langford beat Joe Gans at 17 over 15 rounds for the lightweight title. Now, Cervantes is a great fighter, you know, one of the greats. I don't think he's in a Hall of Fame, but I think he should be if he isn't. But Joe Gans is like top 20 all-time greatest fighter of the time at the time. And Sam Langford just went in as a 17-year-old and beat him over 15 rounds. But he missed the weight by 2 pounds, so he never won the title. And Langford's run is in this next thing, so I'll cover Langford because, I mean, that's like top 2 on this list. But yeah, Benitez, yeah, crazy achievement. Will never be broken again, that. Harry Greb going 45-0 in 1 year. This will never, ever, ever be beaten. This is a modern career in today's standards. This is a modern, great career in today's standards, with the competition he beat, all within the space of a year. I mean, fighters don't really have 45 fights nowadays. Fighters have sort of 30 to 40 fights. But across 1919, Greb went 45-0 in that year alone. He actually extended that to 52-0 before losing, and then he would go unbeaten across another 50 fights. Greb is potentially like the god of boxing, really, when it comes to stats. There's no footage of his fights, but there's footage of the men he beat. He obviously beat Gene Tunney, Mickey Walker, beat up Jack Dempsey in sparring. And probably this achievement is probably his second most impressive, because his resume is probably the most impressive achievement of his career. He had 299 fights and he defeated 16 different Hall of Famers, which is the most ever in history, and he fought these guys like 7-8 times. But during 1919, he would defeat multiple Hall of Famers. He defeated Mike McTeague, battling Levinsky multiple times, George K.O. Brown, who I believe off the top of my head was a middleweight contender, but Bill Brennan was a heavyweight. He would box the likes of Mike Gibbons, beat him, Leo Hawke, Billy Misk. Like, these guys are all Hall of Famers ranging from middleweight to heavyweight. He beat quite a few of these guys 4 times this year. Yeah, imagine that. Imagine doing that over your career. You'd be considered one of the all-time greats. But to do this in 1 year, man, I mean, that could be number 1 on this list, to be honest. Billy Bird, and I'm going to include Archie Moore in this. I'm actually going to favour Archie Moore in this one more, but it's the most knockouts in boxing history ever. So Billy Bird had 138 knockouts in his career, and Archie Moore had 132. So Billy Bird officially has the most knockouts. There are other fighters like Jimmy Wilde and Sam Langford who probably had into the 200 or 300 knockouts, but unofficially because lots of their fights weren't recorded. But yeah, Billy Bird officially has the most, but Archie Moore has the second most officially. And Billy Bird beat some good fighters, but he had a lot more fights. He had 356 fights to Archie Moore, who was in the 200s. And I just think the fact that Archie Moore boxed such a high level of competition in comparison. Moore got in with Marciano, he got in with Ali, Ezard Charles, all of the Black Murderers Row, Yvonne Durrell, one of the craftiest fighters of all time. And he scored many of these knockouts into his 40s as well. So that's one. This list here, barring the Valero one, is probably ones that the last 3 I've done are records that will never get beaten. Right, moving on to Joe Louis KO and Max Schmeling. Now this is a bit more niche because this is, you might think, similarly to the Duran one, oh, it's one fight. What's such a good achievement about this? But this was so impactful at the time. There was so much pressure on this fight. So Lewis, before he won the World Heavyweight Championship, had been knocked out by Max Schmeling. It was the only defeat in his career. And this was the rematch. And Max Schmeling was German, Lewis was American. I believe this fight took place in 1938 or 1939. And for anyone that knows even a brief bit about history will know this was on the eve of World War II. So with global war brewing, this fight, especially in America, was basically billed as good against bad. The good guys against the bad guys. There's even a story, the president even called Lewis and said, you have to win this for the good guys. So imagine that pressure to go out and face the only man that's ever knocked you out and beaten you. And you have the whole world watching this fight. And you're basically fighting, in essence, for the good guys. That's how it's being portrayed. And Lewis went out and absolutely blasted Schmeling in a round, defended his title successfully. It's a great story as well because they become lifelong friends. Schmeling helped Lewis out financially as Lewis would struggle when he was a pallbearer at his funeral. But imagine all that pressure to just go out and blow the guy away in a round. And by the time he eventually retired after his... And this would be pretty early on during his crazy long title reign as champion. So when he eventually retired, he had a record of 58-1. So that was the only one defeat, meaning basically he perfected his record as the greatest boxer of all time at this point because he had beaten everyone he ever faced in just such dominant fashion. And the nature of this fight is, it's crazy. Right, we're starting to go a little bit lower now. I'm a boxing nerd, so I love these ones more than the more popular ones. Sam Langford's run from lightweight to heavyweight. So I've already touched upon Sam Langford. Possibly the greatest fighter that's ever lived and undeniably the greatest fighter to never be a world champion. So as I said, at 17 years of age, he beat the lightweight Joe Gans in a title fight but never got the title because he missed weight. The following year at 18, he boxed Barbados Joe Walcott, who similarly is one of the all-time great welterweight champions. And he beat him for the title again, made the weight this time, but he was robbed. Just to make his dominance at welterweight even more known, he beat young Peter Jackson, the successive champion, twice. He then moved up to heavyweight to box Jack Johnson. So he jumped 147 pounds to heavyweight. Can you imagine, like, Boots Ennis jumping up and facing Anthony Joshua? And he lost to Johnson, but he went the full 15. But over the next sort of decade or so, he would have 40 fights against heavyweight Hall of Famers in Joe Jeanette, Sam McVeigh, Kid Norfolk, and Harry Wills. And he would knock them all out. These are some of the great heavyweights of the time. Jack Johnson would never give him a rematch. Jack Dempsey avoided him like the plague. But Langford didn't just go up to heavyweight and stay there. I think he was 5'7". I think he was maybe around the same height as Roberto Duran. And these were big heavyweights, by the way. Great heavyweights. But he didn't just stay there. He knocked out the light heavyweight, all-time great and Hall of Famer, Philadelphia Jack O'Brien. And he knocked out the future middleweight all-time great, a future middleweight world champion, Tiger Flowers, as well as defeating Stanley Ketchel, who was the middleweight champion of the world at the time. And Ring Magazine founder Nat Fleischer, who died in 1972, said Ketchel was the greatest middleweight he ever saw. And that was after the reign of Sugar Ray Robinson. So it's the greatest resume alongside Harry Greb's ever compiled. Charles' run from middleweight to heavyweight. I've covered these ones quite a lot lately, but yeah, this is severely underrated. Charles basically, I'm going to try and cut through these a little bit quicker now. At 19, he boxed the great middleweights of his era. Ken Overlin, he lost to Ken Overlin, but Overlin had 152 fights and was recently the champion. He then beat Teddy Yaros and Anton Christoforidis, who were both world champions at the time, and then drew with Overlin and then beat Charlie Burley twice. Now, Charlie Burley has a case for being the greatest fighter that's ever lived. Some people say it. Archie Moore said he's the greatest fighter he ever faced. And then he moved up from middleweight to light heavyweight, and he cleared that division for about 6 years. He beat Archie Moore 3 times. He beat the champion, Joey Maxim, 5 times out of 5. Gus Lesnovich, he beat Jimmy Bivens twice. Lloyd Marshall 3 times. Now, these guys are serious Hall of Famers. And for years, he racked his record up to 71-5 and never got a title shot, despite beating the champions of the time 9 times out of 9. Light heavyweight alone. He also beat the middleweight champions, granted. So he moved up to heavyweight and then beat Jersey Joe Walcott twice and Joe Louis to become champion. And he nearly beat Rocky Marciano. He was a round away after going 15 rounds. The only man to go 15 rounds with Marciano. When I talk about Roy Jones' run from middleweight to heavyweight, Roy Jones fought a bigger fighter in John Ruiz, but this is the greatest ever run from middleweight to heavyweight. Henry Armstrong's simultaneous 3-division title reign. Yeah, this one is nuts. 3-division champions don't seem like a lot these days, but imagine if you held 3 divisions all at the same time, undisputed. Now imagine if there were no junior or super divisions in between. So instead of holding 3 divisions, in modern context, you would hold all the belts in 5 divisions all at the same time. That's what Armstrong did. And he did this in a period of 61 fights, where he lost once to a man he'd already beaten, and he drew in a robbery. He had scored 51 knockouts of those 59 wins, and he'd even moved up to middleweight in that robbery, and it was scored a draw. So basically, Armstrong ruled 4 of the divisions in the 8-division era. He ruled half of boxing all at the same time. Imagine a fighter today winning titles across 7 divisions all at the same time. Armstrong defended the belts at welterweight 19 times, which is still a record, and he beat Lou Ambers, he beat Barney Ross, he beat Baby Arismendi, Seferino Garcia, and tons more Hall of Famers during this streak. And he basically did it all by a knockout, despite being so much smaller, and he became the fighter of the 1930s decade. Which then takes me to the 1940s, where these two compiled Willie Pep and Sugar Ray Robinson, 2 of the undeniable goats of the sport. Each man lost just once in around 130 fights. I believe Robinson went 128-1 off the top of my head, and Pep went 134-1. Now, both men had a draw there as well, so there was 1 loss and 1 draw. But, I mean, yeah, both of these men were champions. Pep was champion across the featherweight division. He went 62-0 and then 72 fights unbeaten. And Robinson went 39 fights unbeaten and then 91 fights unbeaten. And yeah, they basically carved out their greatness during these reigns. Robinson had over 80 knockouts in this streak. Had also moved up to win the middleweight title after dominating the welterweight scene. And yeah, I mean, this is when people say, oh, Floyd went 50-0 or Calzaghe went 46-0. I think, yeah, but Robinson went 91-0. Greb went 62-0 and then 72-0 against serious fighters too, moving up the weight divisions. Robinson was also clearing out the lightweights like Sammy Angot. So he basically went from lightweight to middleweight, which again, in modern context, is 5 divisions. And even Very briefly after this, challenged the light heavyweight champion. So going from beating the best lightweights at 135 to fighting the best light heavyweights at 175 is ridiculous. Jimmy Wilde going 93-0. This is the official longest undefeated streak of a world champion. It was 94 fights. There was one draw. You get a few different sources that say it was 96 fights. But yeah, it was definitely well over 90. It's more than Robinson's or Chavez. Now, Wilde only weighed 96 pounds. He was active in the 1910s, the early 20th century, and he was, they called him the ghost with the hammer in his hands. He was slick, elusive, but he ended up scoring 99 career knockouts in just shy of around 140 fights. So this guy could seriously punch. He was so good that they made the flyweight championship of the world a thing, and he became the first ever flyweight world champion. Was consistently beating up bantamweights and knocking out featherweights. Yeah, an absolute monster of a man. Right, 2 more tiers. We're going to go down to the ones that are a bit more niche now. George Chuvalo, heavyweight contender of the 1960s. Never dropped in his entire career, in over 90 fights at heavyweight. That is impressive. Never been dropped at heavyweight. There's very, very few. I believe Oliver McCall was never dropped. A frequent sparring partner of Mike Tyson and boxer Lennox Lewis and tons of other top guys. And I believe Vitaly Klitschko was never dropped. But they were fighting in... they didn't fight fighters. McCall did, but Chuvalo had an absolute killer of punches that he faced. And he did it over twice the amount of fights as McCall, nearly. Chuvalo boxed Joe Frazier, Muhammad Ali twice, George Foreman, Floyd Patterson, Oscar Bonavena, Ernie Terrell. He beat Doug Jones, who was the man who dropped Ali. He also fought Zora Foley. He defeated Jerry Quarry. He was in with everyone. And he was a brawler. He had a really solid chin, the greatest chin in history, because even when guys like Frazier were pounding it, he just wouldn't move. He'd had to get stopped because his face was just taking too much damage, but he just didn't even show signs of slowing down. An absolutely titanium level chin. Right, this next one, you might look at this and be like, how's that an achievement? 279 defeats in his career. But this is Christian Late, who was a British boxing journeyman. Now, I know Christian. I actually set him up to go on a podcast with Johnny Knoxville. You can check that podcast out on Spotify. Johnny Knoxville interviews Christian Late about his boxing career. But he lost 279 fights. He ended up having 300 career fights, which is one more than the great Harry Greb. For those of you that don't understand what Christian Late's role is in boxing, he's a journeyman. He's the backbone of the sport, and he will fight prospects coming up, and he will give them a good run for their money and the experience they need in future fights. Now, pro boxing is absolutely shit when it comes to getting fights made. Fights fall through all the time, and in order to be able to build your career, you need to fight. So Late would turn up late notice, save shows, keep people fighting. The prospects would pay around £1,000 to £2,000 probably, I would imagine. Maybe it was a bit less when he was boxing. He was boxing in the 2000s. I think he had his last fight. I can't remember, but yeah, he was active as I was watching boxing. His last fight was in 2018, where he had his 300th fight. But the thing with him, right, is yes, he lost a lot of the times, but he was a very good fighter. There's no way you get through 300 fights like that. And many of the fighters that he would have boxed, he probably would have deserved a win, but he wouldn't have got one because it doesn't serve the prospects well losing to him. But the most impressive thing is he was only ever stopped 5 times. Now, he boxed so many top fighters coming through. He boxed loads of British champions: Tyrone Nurse, Tommy Coyle, Lewis Ritson, Kevin Mitchell, Derry Matthews. There's loads. And he, to be stopped 5 times, he served a great purpose for boxing, and I believe that his career deserves some recognition. Right, now if we're talking about a tough career, Christian Late having 300 fights, there's no careers or no fighter that personifies toughness as much as Carmen Basilio. Carmen Basilio was the rugged, rough brawler of the 1950s. He was a welterweight and middleweight world champion, and he was involved in the fight of the year 5 times in a row. Now you might be thinking, wow, that's crazy. But it's even worse it's even more grueling when you consider this is the 15-round era. 2 of those fights were against Sugar Ray Robinson for the middleweight title. He went and beat Sugar Ray Robinson over 15 rounds to become middleweight champion and lost the rematch. But before that, he had the fight of the year against Tony DeMarco, which, oh man, he boxed him a couple of times. And I've never seen a fighter take as much punishment and come back to win. I'm going to put the clips up here. It's absolutely brutal. And then he had the fight of the year against Johnny Saxton, a trilogy within a year before fighting Sugar Ray Robinson twice. So from 1955 to 1959, he was in the fight of the year against Tony DeMarco, who he boxed twice in that time, Johnny Saxton, who he boxed 3 times within that time, Sugar Ray Robinson, who he boxed twice within that time, and Gene Foreman, the great middleweight champion, who he boxed twice within that time. He won 3 of those 5 fight of the years. No one will ever do that again, and I wouldn't recommend anyone to do it. Right, moving on to the longest unbeaten streak officially in boxing history belongs to an American boxer called Packy McFarland. Now, he was widely considered to be alongside Sam Langford, maybe Charlie Burley as well, as again, the greatest fighter to never win a world title. Now, it does vary. He lost in his, if you look on his record, he lost his 9th fight, and then he would never lose again in a career that spanned 113 fights. He scored 50 knockouts. He had loads of newspaper decisions. Now, that was just the thing back in the day. Newspaper decisions, basically, for a long time in the early 20th century, boxing was illegal. So rather than having a judge there that scored the fight, the journalist that watched the fight would score the fight, and it would be resulted in the papers the following day. So like Harry Greb has newspaper decisions, Gene Tunney, Sam Langford, they all do. It was just the thing at the time. But McFarland defeated great fighters in Owen Moran. He drew with Freddie Welsh and Jack Britton, whilst beating those guys as well. Jimmy Britt as well. Some of the greatest lightweights and welterweights of all time. He was a very skillful fighter, and his unbeaten streak is probably the longest that we have recorded. Right, Bob Fitzsimmons. The Cornish, he was born in Cornwall. Middleweight champion to heavyweight champion. Now, if you thought that what Roy Jones did was trailblazing, you are wrong. It was unbelievable, but it had been done before. And the fact that Roy Jones did it after such a long time was impressive. But it just goes to show how crazy Bob Fitzsimmons doing it was, because he did it in very late 19th to very early 20th century. I mean, he was in with Jack Johnson, so that's a level of competition he was facing. He was past his best when he did that. And Jim Jeffries. But he beat Jim Corbett for the heavyweight championship. He beat Peter Maher, lost to Tom Sharkey. Beat the legendary non-Perel Jack Dempsey by KO in the 13th round to win the middleweight title. And then years later, I mean, it was absolutely years later, he won the heavyweight title. But it was over a decade later, I think it was 12 years later, that he would beat George Gardner to become light heavyweight champion of the world, whilst also beating Philadelphia Jack O'Brien. In doing this, Fitzsimmons was considered the greatest fighter that's ever lived by many at the time. And these achievements probably have never been overtaken by another British fighter. Final section, we're getting into the ones that are very obscure, but still unbelievable and need to be known. Jack Britton, one of the greatest welterweight champions of the early 20th century. He was stopped in his 3rd fight by a knockout when he was very early on. He would then go on to have 342 fights, many 10, 15 and 20 rounders, and he would never be stopped again. These 342 fights took place over around 25 years. So over 25 years in this brutal era, he was never stopped. He had a ridiculous amount of title fights at welterweight, over 30, and he boxed the legendary Hall of Famer Ted Kid Lewis, English fighter, 20 times. He also fought the 2nd greatest lightweight of all time, one of boxing's all-time greats, Benny Leonard, a fellow all-time great in welterweight and middleweight champion Mickey Walker, who Bert Sugar ranks amongst the 10 greatest fighters of all time, and Packy McFarland, who went 100 fights unbeaten, and he was never stopped. I mean, that's just an unrivaled showing of toughness. And then we have Leicester's Len Whitwer. He was from Leicester, which is in England. You might know Leicester as winning the Premier League at 5,000 to 1 odds. That's where Len Whitwer was from. His is one of my favourite achievements, and this is one that's never, ever, ever been broken. It might not officially be the record. You know, there's suggestions that Jimmy Wild and Sam Langford had 600 fights, but all of Whitwer's fights were recorded. He had a mind-blowing 473 professional fights, primarily in the 1930s. That's the most ever on record. Winning 340 of those means that he also has the most wins in history too, with 340 victories to 87 defeats and 42 draws, scoring 91 knockouts. Now, this hellacious activity was scheduled around a 19-year career. But the most bizarre thing is that 6 of those years he was inactive due to the Second World War in the late 30s and the early to mid 1940s, which means Whitwer squeezed 469 fights in across 12 years. Had he have not had to suffer the inactivity during the war and been able to keep up that pace, by the time his career finished, because he ultimately came back to the ring and had a couple of more fights, he would have had somewhere like 700 to 800 pro fights. Most of his fights went over the 10-round distance. He boxed over 4,000 rounds, and he competed over 50 times a year on 3 different occasions, whilst going over 40 times a year on 5 different occasions. He also went the 12-round distance with Billy Bird, who, again, we're linking up now, is the man in this list with the most knockouts in history. He also boxed Hall of Famers Freddie Miller and Jack Kidberg. Right, 2 to go. We're going to go on to legendary Frenchman Marcel Cerdan, who is one of the greatest world champions you probably don't know. He was middleweight champion of the world when he knocked out Tony Zale with a brutal knockout. Cerdan was just such a beautiful, aggressive fighter to watch. His eventual record was 110 wins to 4 defeats and 65 knockouts. He, again, would suffer because of the war. Basically, his prime years were during the war. So whilst he kept active, the middleweight championship of the world wasn't available. So he was just fighting all the names he could during the war. The record here is the fact that across his first 108 fights, he won 106. But those 2 defeats were fights he was in complete control of. I think in one of those fights, he dropped the guy like 5 times. Those 2 defeats came from low blows that he threw against the opponent when he was beating him up and the referee disqualified him. So whilst McFarlane's 100 plus fights unbeaten streak is officially, Cerdan basically beat everyone over 108 fights. He then lost to Cyril Delanoy, who would fight the likes of Sugar Ray Robinson, losing the European title, which Cerdan had won during this run. And then he avenged the defeat to Delanoy and knocked out Tony Zale to become Ring Magazine, NYSAC and NBA middleweight champion of the world. He beat Dick Turpin before losing to Jake LaMotta, losing his title via a 9th round stoppage. But you have to understand the context of this fight. Cerdan was a really special fighter, and they were talking about a fight with Sugar Ray Robinson, which Robinson started losing to lesser middleweights than Cerdan at that time, so it would have been very intriguing. But against LaMotta in a title defence, he was expected to win. It was ultimately the last fight of his career, by the way, too. LaMotta had tussled him on the floor and dislocated his shoulder in the 1st or 2nd round. So Cerdan actually went around 7-8 rounds with a dislocated shoulder. The rematch was set. Cerdan was a heavy favourite, and on his way to meet his lover, the famous singer Edith Piaf, who I think he had a wife, but he had an affair with Edith Piaf. He died in a plane crash in his 30s. One of boxing's biggest what ifs. Very, very sad story, but yeah, his 106-2 is just one of those crazy, crazy records. And the last one on this list is Georges Carpentier, who boxed across every division available in boxing throughout his pro career. Carpentier, it was one of the most famous fighters of his era as well in the 1920s. The Frenchman made his debut at flyweight at 14 years of age in a scheduled 20-rounder, which he won via disqualification in the 13th round. I mean, like, this was in 1908. I mean, these old school stories are just different level, man. He then lost his second fight just the following month. No, the same month, at the end of the same month, via an 18th round TKO. Fighting 20 rounders at flyweight at 14. Man, that's just crazy. Anyway, the next year, he would move up and score a draw in the French bantamweight title fight. At 17, he won the French welterweight title. And then at 18, he won the inaugural IBU middleweight world title. He had a claim when he beat Jim Sullivan at middleweight at 18 years of age. At 19, he won the same title at light heavyweight and then won it in the same year at heavyweight. But it would be light heavyweight where he really cemented his legacy. At 26 years of age, he beat Battling Levinsky, the Hall of Famer, for the light heavyweight title. And in his following fight, he would take on Jack Dempsey for the heavyweight championship of the world. I mean, what a story. Going from 20 rounds in your debut at flyweight to fighting Jack Dempsey for the heavyweight championship of the world in 1921. Now, this is a very, very famous fight. One of the most famous fights in history because it was that one you've seen the pictures of where around 90,000 people turned up and it generated boxing's first $1 million gate. So he basically went pro at flyweight and then was involved in the biggest heavyweight title fight and won titles at certain levels across pretty much every division through the sport. He also fought Gene Tunney, defeated the great Ted Kid Lewis, fought the all-time great Tommy Loughran a few times. Yeah, Carpentier is widely considered, alongside Sedan, one of the greatest French fighters of all time. And his run from flyweight to heavyweight will never ever be matched. But anyway, that's the video. I hope you enjoyed.